NBC News reporting tonight that the other main prosecution witness in the Trump criminal trial, Michael Cohen, has, since the verdict, had his whole family doxxed. People have posted street addresses and other personally identifying information for his wife and for his children. NBC News also reported that in the immediate wake of the verdict, pro-Trump message boards posted a high volume of violent threats toward both the prosecutor and the judge in the New York case, including what purported to be the home address of District Attorney Alvin Bragg and what purported to be the home addresses of some of the jurors from the case. This is what it's like for people who are part of the legal system when the legal system is getting Donald Trump in trouble. And this is an ongoing thing. This is not going away. There's lots of pending cases against Trump. And these threats and the harassment and intimidation of people who are involved in the legal system, people who are witnesses, jurors, prosecutors, judges, court personnel, Trump, encourages it indirectly every time he makes individual people in these legal proceedings a personal target for his criticism and vitriol, and often his lies. He's never, ever discouraged his supporters from mounting the kind of harassment and intimidation campaigns that they have against everyone involved in these cases, including like the court clerks and the family members of the judges and the witnesses themselves and their families too. And it's every time, right? It's not just this current case. Last summer, Trump supporters circulated the purported names and photographs and home addresses of the grand jury, members of the grand jury in Fulton County, Georgia, after that grand jury voted to indict Trump there. This year, before Trump was convicted, in March and April, Reuters counted at least 152 posts on 3 pro-Trump websites urging the beating or killing of Judge Merchan or Judge Engoron in New York or Judge McAfee in Georgia. One January 6 convict who has already served his prison sentence for taking part in the Trump mob attack on Congress. He posted on Twitter a photo of prosecutor Alvin Bragg and a noose. It is terrorizing to the people involved in these cases. And it is systemic. They do it to all of them with all of the cases. It's designed to make the legal system unworkable when it comes to Trump. Right? It's designed to make people unwilling to participate in the system if Trump is involved in the case, because you and your family will be put in danger. Right? It's designed, if you are part of a case involving Trump, if you are considering bringing some sort of legal action, however well justified, that relates to Trump, they want you to fear for your life and for the lives of your family. That's the basic idea behind it, right? We're all supposed to be so scared of what he'll do. We're supposed to be so scared of how crazy his supporters will go that, to be safe, we should just let him do whatever he wants. No matter what it is, just let him get away with it. Because anything that annoys him, anything that holds him back, anything that punishes him for what he's done, they'll get so mad. And we should be so scared of what they'll do because, you wouldn't like them when they're mad. Trump was asked this weekend about his potentially being sent to prison when he gets sentenced next month. He said this in response. He said, quote, "I don't know that the public would stand for it. I'm not sure the public would stand for it. I think it would be tough for the public to take. At a certain point, there's a breaking point." He's saying, you jail me, there'll be a breaking point. The public won't stand for it. Sounds like a threat, right? It is a threat. It's the same threat he always makes because he wants us all to feel threatened. But he makes the same threat all the time, right? September 2022, after the FBI served the search warrant at his home at Mar-a-Lago, he says, quote, "I don't know how much more our country will be willing to withstand." 2 months later, December 2022, all caps, "The people of this country aren't going to take it much longer." Then he was asked on a radio show about the possibility of him being criminally indicted. He said, "I think if it happened, I think you'd have problems in this country, the likes of which we've never seen before. I don't think the people of the United States would stand for it. I think they'd have big problems. I just don't think they'd stand for it." Then in March 2023, he said if he was indicted, it would rain down death and destruction. That he said would be, quote, "catastrophic for our country." Death and destruction if he were indicted. Then he was indicted. Then last summer, after he was indicted, he was asked about a possible prison sentence. He says, quote, "I think it's a very dangerous thing to even talk about because we do have a tremendously passionate group of voters. I think it would be very dangerous. Very, very dangerous." So yeah, now he's threatening again that there's going to be catastrophic Civil War level violence if anything bad happens to him, like an indictment, which has happened 4 times, like an arraignment, which has happened multiple times, like a conviction, which has happened 34 times, like a potential prison sentence, which, stay tuned. At every step of the way, he has made the same threat. At every step of the way, he has shaken his fist at the country and warned that if anything happens to him, his followers will rise up and level the place. Death and destruction, like nothing the country has ever seen before. It's always the same threat. It is not actually what they do, because it is not actually how the country feels. If you look at the polling since the verdict in the New York case came down, there's been 3 national polls on reaction to the verdict so far. All of them show that most people in this country think the verdict was the right thing. The country is not rising up en masse to defend him. By and large, the country thinks, he committed crimes and it makes sense that he was convicted of them. These threats that if anything happens to him in the legal system, the country won't stand for it and there will be mass violence and there will be blood in the streets and there will be riots. You'll see it rising up like the country has never seen before. That is not happening. What is happening is his followers are terrorizing individual people involved in the legal process. And the Republican Party at the highest level and with almost total uniformity is simultaneously telling the American people that the American legal system is bunk and they shouldn't respect it and they shouldn't trust it. And Republicans at the state level are not just tolerating and trying to get away with election crimes to help Trump. Criminal election subversion is now being celebrated and rewarded, even in places where criminal prosecutions of these folks are ongoing. Places like Arizona and Nevada, fake Trump electors are charged with felonies there. But the accused felons have also just been given big new jobs by the state Republican Party in those states. They've been named delegates to the National Republican Convention and state representatives to the Republican National Committee. They've done the same with one of the fake electors in Wisconsin, where Republicans are trying again to recall a state legislative leader who acted, in their mind, with insufficient fervor to overthrow the election results in Wisconsin when Biden won that state and Trump lost. I mean, in Nevada, 2 of the state's official electors for the 2024 election will be people who are currently under indictment for what they did as fake electors in the last election. In the Republican Party right now, January 6th defendants are hostages and heroes who will be fully and immediately pardoned. Fake electors will be new party leaders. Brave souls who said no to the coup, who, people who Democrats and normal people briefly tried to lionize for their bravery, people like, Vice President Mike Pence, they are roundly rejected by their party. While prosecutors and judges and witnesses and jurors are hounded and threatened daily. This is not something about which you can sort of put your head down and wait it out, because these cases are going to go on and on. But we are in a moment where the burden of intimidation and harassment and threatened violence, the burden of what's going on in the Trump movement is terroristic. It's not mass violence. The burden of what is being threatened against our fellow Americans is falling disproportionately on a very small number of people. It's falling on individual people they are singling out to try to pick them off in order to intimidate the whole country. There isn't a civil war. There isn't a riot. I was promised there would be riots if Trump were convicted. There were no riots. There hasn't even been a good-sized pro-Trump protest anywhere in years. They are not using mass action. They are using targeted harassment and threats towards specific people to try to cow all of us, to make us all scared of anything that holds Trump to account and punishes him for committing crimes, right? And so the solution to that is not rocket science, right? It's not complex. It's like a couple of things, right? Fairly obviously. 1, we vociferously defend more than we have been the people who are being intimidated and harassed and threatened, both because they deserve that as human beings, but also because they are standing in for all of us. This small number of people is being attacked in order to make all of us afraid, so that we as a country will change our behavior, so that we will, in the words of Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, we will obey in advance. So we will cower and try to make sure we only do things that make Trump happy because we're so scared of the response. There are individual people who are bearing the brunt of terroristic intimidation by the pro-Trump movement that is designed not only to ruin those people's lives and get retribution against them, but to scare all of us, that it could happen to any of us. It could happen to all of us. If we don't stand up for those people, that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's one. Stand up for those people and protect those people better than we have been. Recognize that they are small in number and they can all be protected. That's one. Second, don't cower, right? If that means there are going to be yet more federal charges brought, and there might be, we should not cower about the prospect that Trump and his supporters will get mad if Trump is held to account. Yes, they'll be mad. That's their problem. More federal charges may yet be brought if that is where that investigation leads. If so, so be it. There's no reason anybody should shy away from that. More state charges may yet be brought. There are open investigations, not just in Michigan, but in some of the other states where they have pronounced Trump, for example, to be an unindicted co-conspirator. They have also said the investigation is ongoing. In more states, there may yet be more state charges. If so, if that is where those investigations lead, so be it. There's no reason anyone should shy from that. We are at a moment when the Republican Party says the legal system doesn't work. The criminals are the heroes. Everybody involved in making the legal system work should fear for their lives. Trump says the country will rain down fire if he faces any more legal consequences. The Republican Party is wrong about that, and Trump is wrong about that. Our system is strong. And so we should feel very confident in standing up to protect it. Our system is strong, and so are we.
All 16 electors that we've been advised by the governor's staff that we're going to be here to vote in the Electoral College have been checked in. We're already here.
But these are the rest of the electors.
I understand. The Capitol is closed.
That was outside the Michigan State Capitol, December 2020. That scene ultimately led to the indictment of 16 alleged fake electors for Donald Trump in Michigan. It led more recently to testimony in a Michigan state courtroom on Friday, this past Friday. As reported in the Detroit News, that same officer who turned the fake electors away at the door to the state capitol, he testified in court on Friday that he, quote, had been interviewed Thursday by someone from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and 2 U.S. prosecutors from Washington, D.C. Thursday, of course, was also the day a jury in New York found Donald Trump guilty in a hush money plot to save his campaign in 2016. We now know that same day, federal investigators apparently were interviewing Michigan law enforcement in a sign that there is an active federal investigation into the Michigan fake electors scheme. As part of those same court hearings where this news came to light, we also learned that the state investigation in Michigan might not have reached its conclusion yet either. A state investigator telling the court that the Michigan Attorney General's office still has outstanding subpoenas and search warrants as part of what he described as an ongoing state investigation into the Michigan fake electors. He told the court, quote, "It's still an open investigation." He also told the court at one point that investigators were treating the Michigan State Republican Party headquarters as a, quote, crime scene. Joining us now is Craig Mauger. He's politics reporter for the Detroit News. He's been reporting on the fake elector news out of Michigan. Mr. Mauger, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate you joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So this is a sort of sprawling case. There's 16 defendants, and there's been a lot of court proceedings already, not for all of them, but for most of them, that are essentially designed to decide whether or not these charges are going to go ahead. It's a long process. It's a somewhat complex process, given the number of defendants. What do you feel like have been the major revelations from the court proceedings that you've covered so closely thus far?
I think you've hit on a couple of them tonight, that this is very much an ongoing probe. The Attorney General's staff is trying to figure out what the guidance was that was provided to these 16 electors whose signatures ended up on this certificate, falsely claiming that Donald Trump had won Michigan's 16 electoral votes. This investigation is ongoing. There's some element of a federal probe that's looking at this as well that seems very much ongoing, as you mentioned. The key thing here is the Attorney General's office has to prove, as part of this case, to be successful, that these individuals had an intent to defraud the public. The question is, did these individuals have that intent, or was someone essentially fooling them into signing this document, not letting them know what the true purpose of the document was, and then turning around, taking their signatures and doing something different than what they had told them they were going to do? That's the crux of all of this. And if it's not their intent to defraud, if it's someone else's, the question is, whose was that and why have they not been charged so far?
Right. And to have the state prosecutors in Michigan, the investigators, say, we've got these 16 defendants, but here's another 11 people who are unindicted co-conspirators, including the former president, including his top lawyer. I mean, they are painting a sprawling picture, but the charges haven't necessarily followed all of the allegations. At this point, that's, Craig, part of the reason I wanted to talk to you is that I was really surprised by this revelation that you reported in court on Friday, that there does appear to be an ongoing federal investigation here, a federal investigation on top of what's going on with the state. Do you have any sense from what's been disclosed in court what the contours might be of that federal investigation?
Well, the police captain who revealed this, and everyone in the courtroom was surprised by this. The defense attorneys were surprised. Even the judge kind of used the word surprise to talk about this statement that was made by the Michigan police captain all of a sudden, kind of out of the blue, is kind of a traditional line of questioning. Who else have you talked to? And this police captain says, I talked to some people yesterday from Washington, D.C. Everyone kind of froze for a second. What do you mean you talked to someone from Washington, D.C. yesterday? He said that this interview focused wholly on the electors. This was about the electors. This wasn't some other issue. This was an interview that lasted some amount of time talking about these fake electoral votes that these people brought to the doorstep of the Michigan Capitol on December 14, 2020. He said that they didn't ask about specific individuals. He read a list of some names. Did they ask about this person? He said no. It must have been, from what I could tell from his testimony, it must have been kind of overall what happened when you were at the doorstep. These people came to the door, you answered. What happened?
And it was FBI personnel and federal prosecutors. And it's
exactly
now
right
that they're asking him these questions. Wow. It's amazing. It's very important to keep your old tape. When you play tape of something that happens, hold on to it for longer than you'd hold on to your tax records, because you never know when the FBI will finally follow up on the crime that you aired on your TV show. Craig Mauger, you've really helped us and the whole country follow the nitty-gritty of these stories as they've unfolded, and they seem to be unfolding in more and more important ways. So we're really grateful for you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Craig Mauger, politics reporter for the Detroit News. All right.